Hey there, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. But only if you really enjoy this type of content. Now, imagine waking up, not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of your entire family stirring, all packed into a small dirt floor shelter. There's no snooze button, no bathroom privacy, and no breakfast waiting. In the Paleolithic world, the very first task of the day was survival. Did the fire survive the night? If not, things could turn deadly fast. From checking embers and gathering kindling, to avoiding predators and starting the day without food, cavemen mornings were anything but calm. In this episode, we'll explore exactly what our early ancestors did from the moment they opened their eyes, and why even something as small as losing the fire could change everything. Waking up in the Paleolithic era wasn't the peaceful, solitary experience you might imagine today. You could forget about personal space, or even personal anything really. Picture this. Stretched out on a patch of compacted earth or animal hides with your entire family, and possibly a few more relatives thrown in for good measure. Everyone's breathing, tossing, turning. Maybe someone's snoring loud enough to send the wolves running. Privacy. That was a luxury future humans would invent, long after survival stopped being a full-time job. And yet, there was a kind of logic behind this communal arrangement. Imagine a world where staying warm was a daily battle, and being alone at night could mean being an animal's midnight snack. Group sleeping was more than practical. It was survival 101. Bodies huddled together on chilly nights created shared warmth. A literal human furnace spread across a dozen family members. Even children, who might have squirmed and fidgeted, served their part. They often slept positioned near the center of the group, shielded from cold drafts and predators. Having restless kids around didn't just test patience, it was an evolutionary strategy, a way of making sure the youngest and most vulnerable were kept safe. But let's face it, sleeping shoulder to shoulder with, say, your mother-in-law, your cousin, and a few toddlers was probably not what anyone would call restful. Every cough, every murmur, every shift on the hard ground added to the ambient noise, leaving very little room for uninterrupted dreams. If someone snored particularly loudly, or a child cried out in their sleep, the whole group would likely stir awake. A broken night's sleep wasn't something you could make up for with a quick afternoon latte. Instead, Paleolithic humans simply adapted, accepting, or at least tolerating, these discomforts, because the benefits of sticking together far outweighed the drawbacks. The idea of being totally alone, or even sleeping apart from the group, was more terrifying than anything a cave full of snorers could offer. Of course, waking up together was just the start of the day's challenges. For early humans, there were no alarm clocks, but you could bet the sunrise usually nudged a few bleary-eyed folks into action at the first light creeping through the cracks of their shelter or cave. Groggily stirring awake, one of the first things on most people's minds, aside from trying to locate that one stone they accidentally rolled onto while sleeping, was the fire. Did it make it through the night? The fire wasn't just a convenience, it was quite literally life. Without its warmth or protection, your little community would be in immediate trouble, especially in colder climates where hypothermia could sneak up quickly. But we'll come back to fire in a minute, because there's still more to say about these pre-dawn moments in the cramped conditions of a Paleolithic home. Imagine waking up to the sound of someone cracking joints or coughing. Maybe someone's already stretching their sore muscles, stiff from the uneven ground. There's no brushing it off either. Every movement, every habit, even stretching too far, was part of a group experience shared whether people wanted it or not. You didn't wake up alone. You woke up as part of a living, breathing organism, where the health and survival of one meant something to everyone else. People adapted to this invasive closeness the way they adapted to everything else in their environment. They learned to make it work. It wasn't just about getting through individual discomforts. It was about thriving together in harsh environments. The occasional pebble digging into your back or a cold elbow jabbing you in the side was part of the package. In a way, these small inconveniences weren't even worth complaining about. After all, what option was there besides enduring? Maybe a quiet grumble under the breath, aimed at no one in particular, before grabbing a stone tool or animal hide to get started on the day. Speaking of starting the day, one of the most important tasks first thing in the morning was making sure the fire didn't die overnight. And fire wasn't some casual background feature in their lives. It was everything. Waking up to find only cold ash where there should have been embers was nothing short of devastating. Without fire, there'd be no cooking for proper meals, no way to ward off predators circling in the dark, and no warmth for the little ones tucked between layers of fur. Responsibility for managing this lifeline varied across groups, but it wasn't unusual for some of the older, less mobile members of the group to tend to the fire overnight, waking periodically to stoke it or feed it more fuel. Those early minutes of the day were filled with tension as someone crept over to check. Was the fire still alive? If yes, there was a small collective sigh of relief. If no, well, things would get messy quickly. Rebuilding a fire from scratch wasn't like sparking a match. It involved careful preparation, skill, and time. Not to mention a lot of luck, especially if the weather was damp. It wasn't a process anyone liked to repeat more than necessary, which is why embers were often kept alive by insulating them in materials like moss or bark. In some cases, if a group was on the move, they would literally carry those embers nestled in a primitive container to ensure the fire traveled with them. But back to those mornings. In the fragile light of dawn, as everyone roused from their restless sleep, you could already see how the rhythm of the day began to shape itself. There was no lounging in bed or slow sipping of coffee, just the pressing demands of survival. The reality of living so communally shaped their mindset. You weren't just you were part of something larger, part of a group that relied on you just as much as you relied on them. If one person was slow to wake, it might mean no embers for the fire. If someone else was sluggish getting ready, the group's hunt or forage might stall before it even began. In those moments, the lack of privacy did something fascinating. It created an unspoken system of accountability. You didn't go unnoticed. If you stayed sprawled out too long while others got to work, it wasn't the sort of thing people ignored. And this wasn't limited to mornings. There were no secrets in these tight-knit clusters. Whether it was an embarrassing snore the night before, or accidentally knocking over part of the firewood pile first thing in the morning, being part of a Paleolithic family meant being constantly seen. Your contributions, your faults, and sometimes even your amusing quirks. It's worth thinking about, though, what this communal life did for the human psyche. Sure, it stripped people of privacy and likely led to more than a few squabbles over space. But it also created incredible resilience. Waking up like this every day, side by side with others, gave humans something their environment couldn't easily take away: connection. No one lived entirely alone. And while that connection came with its share of annoyances, someone hogging the warmest spot near the embers, or a cousin who seemed to snore directly into your ear. It also came with security. You woke up knowing that if trouble came, you wouldn't be facing it by yourself. As each day began this way, a familiar rhythm settled in. Before anyone thought too far ahead into the day, about the hunt, the search for food, or the countless other things that had to go right, fire was the immediate focus. There was no point planning anything else until the group knew they had retained their most important tool for survival. In many ways, the fire dictated the rhythm of their lives. It was the constant heart of the camp. Whether in moments of leisure, tension, or quiet beginnings like these. And so, with the groggy sounds of early movement fading and the first hints of flame crackling back to life, the group moved into its next phase. Bodies warmed, tools checked, and maybe a quick, wordless glance shared between two family members as they silently agreed, time to get to work. The morning rhythm wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it worked because it had to. Without it, another night might not come. And speaking of rhythm, now we shift to what made fire more than just an accessory for survival. It was the backbone of everything they did next. Imagine crawling out of your sleeping spot and realizing the fire, the one thing your group relied on for warmth, food, and safety, has gone cold. No glowing embers, just a pile of grey ash mocking you in the morning light. If you felt a chill run down your spine, it isn't just the lack of fire, it's the potential disaster that comes with it. Keeping the flame alive wasn't just some chore on a checklist, it was survival itself. Lose that fire, and everything else becomes infinitely more dangerous and complicated. Fire meant warmth, and warmth wasn't just about comfort in the Paleolithic world. It could stop frostbite on an especially harsh night. It kept predators like wolves and leopards from wandering too close while you slept, and it turned raw food, sometimes infested with bacteria or parasites, into something not just safer to eat, but easier to digest. Losing it wasn't like losing a flashlight with dying batteries. It was more like losing your life jacket in the middle of the ocean. Having fire meant staying one step ahead of nature's sharpest teeth, claws, and freezing breath. But fire wasn't exactly patient. It didn't sit obediently and wait for you to tend to it when you had a free moment. Someone in the group had to keep an eye on it constantly, feeding it dry wood at just the right time, fanning it softly when it got too low, or adjusting barriers to protect it from sudden gusts of wind that might carry it away in a puff of sparks. If you forgot, even for a little while, and those flames died down, you'd better believe you'd hear about it. As the research puts it, no one got praised for keeping the fire going. But if it went out, there were no excuses, just a lot of angry looks, and the sentence, "Guess who's making sparks tonight?" Letting the fire die meant everyone's day was suddenly a lot harder and a lot colder. Now, let's talk about starting a fire if it did go out. Forget the image of striking a match or flicking a lighter within seconds. Early humans weren't exactly equipped with convenience stores for emergency supplies. Fire had to be created from scratch, using friction-based tools like hand drills or fire plows. And no, it wasn't as cinematic as you might think. There was no instant blaze, no dramatic moment of triumph with flames roaring to life. This process was long, tedious, and physically demanding, basically a full workout for your arms. It involved grinding a stick into a groove of dry wood until the friction created enough heat to spark a tiny ember. Once that ember appeared, the next critical step was gently blowing it into a flame without snuffing it out completely. If the materials were too damp or the wind wouldn't cooperate, you could be at it for hours with nothing to show but sore hands and a growing sense of frustration. This is why most Paleolithic groups didn't let the fire go out in the first place. It was easier and safer to keep it alive, even barely, than to risk losing it entirely. Sometimes, if a group needed to move camps, they'd carry fire with them, literally. They'd take embers from the existing fire, wrapping them in insulating materials like moss or bark to keep them glowing during the journey. Imagine that. Someone's hiking alongside the group, responsible for what is essentially the prehistoric version of an irreplaceable family heirloom. Drop it, lose it, or let it go out, and congratulations, you've just made life exponentially harder for everyone, including yourself. Fire duty wasn't glamorous work. It didn't come with applause or prestige, but it mattered. In many groups, those tasked with keeping the flame alive were often the people who couldn't easily participate in other survival activities, like hunting or gathering. Older adults who couldn't chase prey or wander miles in search of edible plants often filled this role, ensuring the fire stayed fed and protected throughout the day and night. Children were sometimes sent to gather kindling, a task with mixed results. As the research notes, children often helped, though they sometimes brought back things that looked flammable but absolutely weren't, like wet logs or half-buried mushrooms. It was a learning process, and the stakes were high. The importance of maintaining fire became especially clear in cold climates or during the harsh winters. Without fire, frost could creep into shelters, making even the thickest animal hides useless. People did what they could to retain heat internally, huddling together, sharing body warmth. But there was no substitute for sitting near open flames. Fires were like ancient thermostats, maintaining the delicate balance between survival and extreme discomfort. Let's not forget how fire also shaped the way people ate. Cooking food over open flames not only made it safer, as it killed off harmful bacteria, but it also made it easier to chew, digest, and even more calorie-rich in some cases. For Paleolithic groups relying on wild game, tough roots, and whatever other scavenged scraps they could find, this was critical. Eating wasn't about pleasure or preference. It was about sustaining energy. Imagine gnawing on an uncooked hunk of meat or choking down hard tubers day after day. Fire turned these challenges into manageable tasks, softening food into something more edible and even comforting by comparison. But fire's value wasn't just practical. It made nights less dark. Paleolithic nights were long, especially without electricity or the glow of modern cities to keep things lit. The fire acted as both a psychological anchor and a source of light that turned the unknown pitch of the nighttime into something less foreboding. If you could see the fire, you knew you had heat and safety. If you couldn't, well, you'd likely be curled up somewhere shivering and praying nothing with glowing eyes decided you looked like a meal. All of this explains why fire maintenance was such a ritualized, almost sacred element of daily life in the Paleolithic era. It wasn't just a part of the routine, it was the routine. The process of tending to flames set the pace for almost everything else the group did. Before food, before tools, before exploring the areas around their camp, they had to be sure they wouldn't lose the spark that kept them alive. Even with the fire securely burning, mornings were often tinged with apprehension. The day's activities, hunting, foraging, making tools, would take the majority of their energy. To do any of it successfully without fire would have been almost unthinkable. This tiny, flickering presence sat at the center of their world, dictating much of what was possible. As the coals burned softly, casting faint shadows on the dirt and stone, it was clear that fire wasn't just a tool, it was life itself. It acted as both a guardian and a burden, something that people relied on yet had to devote constant attention to. In a world where survival hung by a thread, fire wasn't taken for granted. Even its smallest ember shone with a kind of urgency, a reminder that life at the time demanded constant vigilance and effort. With their fire safe and steadily burning, Paleolithic humans could finally turn their attention to the next challenge, finding something to eat, because while fire could warm their nights and cook their meals, it couldn't fill an empty stomach. And in a world without guarantees, breakfast was less about choice and more about luck, resourcefulness and timing. And that's where we're heading next. Imagine starting your day with a knot in your stomach. Not because you're nervous, but because there's a real chance breakfast might not happen. In the Paleolithic world, mornings were often a gamble, and the stakes were high. Unlike today, there was no stocked pantry or convenient cafe down the road. Whether you started your day with even a bite of food depended entirely on what was left over from the day before, or how quickly and efficiently someone could gather something edible. Breakfast wasn't just the first meal of the day. It was a race against time, hunger, and the unpredictability of nature. If your group had been lucky the previous day, there might be scraps waiting for you. Leftovers weren't frowned upon. They were precious. Maybe there was a sliver of dried meat tucked safely out of reach of scavengers, or kids with sticky fingers. Cracked bones, still holding the fatty marrow inside, were highly prized and often saved for moments of desperation. Even sinews and dried hides, tough as they were, could be chewed on in a pinch. But in a pinch pretty much summarized every moment of life back then. If no one had hunted successfully the previous day, or if the food stores were raided overnight by opportunistic animals, breakfast became a matter of quickly finding something before energy levels dropped, or worse, before someone else, whether human or animal, snagged it first. Foraging often replaced the promise of guaranteed leftovers. With little ceremony, groups might spread out in the soft morning light, each scanning their surroundings for anything that could pass for food. Roots were a reliable option, though they didn't come easily, often requiring a sturdy digging stick and a fair bit of muscle to unearth. Berries and nuts, if they were in season, could brighten the mood, but only slightly. Finding them demanded a sharp eye and a detailed mental map of the landscape. You had to remember which bushes were fruitful and which trees yielded nuts, and even then, there was the risk someone beat you to them. You weren't the only one eyeing that ripe patch of blackberries. Birds, smaller mammals, and even rival human groups might have already picked them clean. And competition didn't just come from other humans. Sometimes it wandered in uninvited, on four legs. Wild pigs rooting through the same patches could quickly become more than just a nuisance. If you threw something in frustration to scare them off, congratulations, you've just armed them with a new reason to charge at you. Even smaller creatures like squirrels might carry off the last decent chestnut you'd been carefully eyeing. Foraging wasn't just about food. It trained sharp reflexes and the ability to outwit the competition. Every berry and nut was an accomplishment in itself. Seasons played another lead role in the drama of breakfast. Spring might offer tender greens, the first edible plants pushing through thawed earth. Summer, a bounty of fruits and seeds, if you were lucky. But winter was the great equalizer. When the landscape turned barren and the usual food sources vanished, creativity and endurance became the only tools you had left. Tree bark, for instance, wasn't just for decoration anymore. Stripped and carefully prepared, it could provide calories, barely. The practicality of plant foods meant that foraging groups often carried an encyclopedic knowledge of what was safe to eat and what might kill you with a single bad decision. It wasn't just eat the berry, avoid the mushroom kind of knowledge. Every plant, every root, carried the weight of trial and error, whispered lessons across generations. That knowledge, born from more failures than successes, quite literally kept your group alive another day. But plants weren't the only items on the menu. Small animals offered a chance for something more substantial. Rabbits, birds, and squirrels were potential candidates, assuming you had the tools and timing to catch one. Traps could help, but they weren't guaranteed to work, especially if they'd been hastily built, or if the animal was smarter than you thought. Sometimes, it wasn't even about catching them alive. A half-eaten bird carcass left by another predator might still be fair game, provided you were brave or hungry enough to clean it and toast it over a fire. And then there were the insects. Yes, bugs. Termite mounds, grubs, and crickets might not win any culinary awards today, but back then, they were crucial sources of protein. Protein that didn't fight back or require hours of preparation. With enough hunger, you might actually start seeing roasted termites as a decent breakfast option, something to eat quickly before moving on to the harder tasks of the day. Foraging wasn't as solitary as you might expect. Often, groups worked together to cover more ground. Women, older adults, and even children did much of the foraging while hunters prepared for other tasks. And those short legs of the tiniest members were surprisingly useful for scouring under shrubs or spotting edible plants low to the ground. Of course, kids weren't the most reliable food gatherers. Sometimes they returned with armfuls of things that looked edible but weren't. Wet leaves, weird rocks, or on occasion, a smirk and nothing at all. Every foraging trip was a teaching moment, with valuable lessons on what was safe, what wasn't, and what absolutely couldn't be trusted, no matter how pretty it looked. That trial and error learning curve. It had real stakes, the kind of stakes where the error could cost a meal or a life. But mistakes often led to better knowledge, and that knowledge was passed down constantly to keep the group food literate in an unforgiving environment. If luck was on your side, breakfast might involve mixing a few different finds, a handful of berries here, a roasted cricket or two there, maybe even a root stew or broth made from foraged greens. It wasn't about taste or variety. Meals in the Paleolithic world weren't planned to delight. They were acts of sheer practicality. Every bite was fuel, keeping you functional for longer tasks ahead, like hunting or building shelter. If you happened to come across something satisfying for your taste buds, well, that was just a happy accident. More often, food was bland, tough, and repetitive, but it kept you alive, and that was enough. But what about those larger animals often romanticized in drawings of Paleolithic hunts? Mammoths, bison, or wild horses. While it's true they provided incredible amounts of meat, they weren't breakfast material. Hunts of that scale took days of planning, teamwork, and often sheer luck. These hunts would rarely, if ever, be something you casually did first thing in the morning. Besides, the risks of taking on a larger animal, injuries, failed attempts, or outright disaster, meant these were high-stakes events, not everyday occurrences, and hunting big game required preparation tools, teamwork, and a lot of energy, much of which came from the smaller, less glamorous meals like your handful of termites or roasted tubers. As unpredictable and resource-intensive as hunting big game was, it became worth the gamble when the payoff came through. Meat could be dried, smoked, and used over time, becoming one of the few food sources that didn't need immediate consumption. A successful hunt relieved some of the daily pressure to forage, allowing mornings the next day to feel less desperate. Until then, though, the reality was simple. Breakfast was a game of chance, and losing meant setting out hungry in conditions that demanded every bit of strength you could muster. There's something humbling about thinking back to the Paleolithic breakfast. It wasn't a modern buffet, it wasn't fast food, and it definitely didn't come with coffee. Instead, it was a quiet but urgent gamble for survival, one handful of food at a time. A reminder, perhaps, that even the simplest things we take for granted, like starting the day with a meal, meant enormous effort for the people who came before us. Each root, each bug, and each leftover scrap represented time, energy, and skill, woven into a life spent constantly adapting to whatever the earth decided to offer or withhold that day. Which brings us to a question. How did they manage all of this? How did these early humans even stand a chance in such an uphill battle? One word: tools. From the digging sticks that unearthed roots to the sharp-edged stone flakes that made small game hunting possible, tools were the key to everything. Next, we'll explore the ingenuity and sheer effort that went into crafting them. How much effort would you put into sharpening a rock if your survival, your next meal, your safety, even your chance to stay warm depended on it? For the Paleolithic humans, that wasn't a hypothetical question. It was life. Tools weren't optional, they were essential. A sharp edge, a well-made handle, or even a functioning scraper could mean the difference between thriving and starving. But making and maintaining these tools, that was no simple task. It required skill, patience, and more trial and error than most of us would have the stamina for. Let's start with the basics. Early tools were simple by today's standards, but they weren't arbitrary. Every piece served a specific purpose, from processing food to building shelter. The simplest tools, like hand axes and scrapers, were carved from stone, often flint or obsidian. These materials weren't chosen by accident. Flint, for instance, chips in predictable patterns, creating sharp edges with each strike. Obsidian, it's even sharper than modern surgical steel when handled correctly. That sharpness made these materials invaluable, though finding them wasn't always easy. If you lived near a good source of flint, you were lucky. If not, you'd either trade with another group or travel significant distances to get your hands on the stuff. The process of making tools was meticulous and often unforgiving. Rocks weren't just picked up and magically transformed into useful implements. Imagine sitting down and holding a chunk of flint. You'd need to strike it carefully with another rock or a piece of hardened antler to chip off flakes. Not just any flake, the right-sized, right-shaped flake. Precision was everything. Strike too hard, and you could shatter the stone. Strike too softly, and you'd waste your energy for nothing. Trial and error barely covers it. A toolmaker couldn't afford to be careless. Each mistake meant starting over, and every wasted rock felt like watching your survival odds crumble. If you were lucky, though, an hour of careful work might get you a fresh hand axe or spearhead. If not, well, back to chipping and hoping for better results. Once those flakes or sharpened pieces were ready, their uses varied. A sharp hand axe, for example, was the Paleolithic version of the multi-tool. It could cut through animal hides, carve wood, or even crack bones to extract the nutrient-rich marrow inside. Scrapers prepared hides for clothing or shelter, smoothing out tough material to make it usable. Then there were spearheads, small but deadly. These transformed long wooden sticks into hunting weapons, capable of piercing the hide of an animal, or if needed, defending against a predator. None of these tools came pre-assembled, of course. Spears required assembly, often using animal sinew to attach the sharp stone point to the shaft. And it wasn't always about stone. Bones and antlers became tools in their own right, carved into awls or needles for stitching hides together. Imagine the patience it would take to file a bone down to a fine point with nothing but a rock. Crafting tools wasn't glamorous work, but it was vital. The stakes for keeping tools in good shape were high. A dull or chipped blade could be disastrous. Cutting through a tough hide with a blunt edge wouldn't just be frustrating. It could waste valuable time and energy that you couldn't spare. Worse, a bad tool could injure you. A slip of a dull knife could mean a deep cut or a shattered rock throwing shards into your hand. Injuries weren't minor inconveniences back then. Even a small wound could mean infection or a complete inability to contribute to the group. And in the Paleolithic era, if you couldn't contribute, you became a liability, a problem that no one wanted to be. Tool maintenance wasn't optional. Early humans spent countless hours grinding, reshaping, or sharpening their tools using stones or even sand. Sometimes it was just to keep a good edge. Other times, it was to repair damage after use. Tools might break after just 1 or 2 uses, especially if they weren't made carefully, so the cycle of creation and repair was constant. Think about smashing your hammer after driving just 1 nail and having to carve or forge a brand new one before you could continue working. That was every day for them. The materials themselves determined what tools could do. Flint and obsidian were effective but brittle, so they were reserved for tasks requiring precision, like cutting. For heavy-duty jobs, breaking bones or shaping wood, denser, less fragile rocks, or even bone tools were ideal. If you were clever enough, you'd combine materials for better versatility. A rock lashed to a stick with sinew might become a rudimentary hammer or axe. These hybrid tools added efficiency to tasks that would otherwise have taken far longer. But even clever designs had limits. Tools wore down quickly, and when they failed, it wasn't just annoying. It could put an entire group's survival at risk. Despite the challenges, tool-making wasn't just a solitary activity. In many groups, certain individuals specialized in it, developing sharper skills and greater experience over time. Someone who could make the perfect spear point or the sharpest scraper became valuable, not just within the group, but to neighboring ones as well. These tools were sometimes traded, fostering connections between different communities. Toolmakers likely earned respect for their expertise, especially when their creations meant successful hunts or efficient food preparation. In an age without currency, the value of a perfectly knapped flint edge couldn't be overstated. Interestingly, the creation of tools also fostered social bonds. The process of making a hand axe might involve teaching younger group members or working alongside others to share techniques. This wasn't just about efficiency. It was about survival through collaboration. Watching someone struggle to shape flint might have been frustrating, but ensuring they learned the skill ultimately strengthened the group as a whole. Every new person who mastered the art of toolmaking was one more person who could keep the fire burning, prepare a meal, or bring down prey. Tool innovation also deserves some credit. Early humans weren't just repeating the same designs forever. Over time, they began to experiment and improve. For example, the addition of handles to tools, which is a big leap in technology, turned handheld rocks into axes and hammers that were easier to use and far more effective. Similarly, bone tools allowed for more delicate work, like making garments from hides, which would have been impossible with a jagged rock alone. Even the seemingly simple act of tying a rock to a stick with sinew represents engineering that paved the way for the tools we use today. Every small improvement wasn't just convenience, it was progress. Life got just a little easier with each breakthrough, though easier in this context still meant backbreaking labor. The communal aspect of tools extended even further. Everyone relied on them for something, whether it was scraping hides, preparing meals, or hunting. Tools connected people. They were borrowed, traded, and repaired cooperatively. Certain groups with access to better materials or more skilled tool makers could exchange their creations for other resources like food or hides. In this way, tools weren't just physical objects, they were threads in the social fabric, tying people together in networks of shared effort and survival. If you think about it, tools were more than just objects. They were extensions of survival instincts. They allowed early humans to reach further, cut deeper, and protect themselves better than their bare hands ever could. A hand axe wasn't just a rock. It was a second chance at life when the odds were against you. A well-made scraper wasn't just a utility. It was warmth in the form of cloaks and shelter. Tools didn't just reflect ingenuity. They embodied the constant battle against the forces of nature, hunger, and danger, all packed into a carefully shaped stone. Now, none of this meant tools made life easy. They eased certain burdens, sure, but using them was still grueling. Processing an animal might take hours, even with the sharpest blade. Cutting firewood wasn't a 2-minute chore. It was a process of trial and error that could leave your arms aching by the end. And mistakes, they were expensive. A broken spearhead or cracked scraper didn't just mean more work. It could mean the difference between eating and going hungry that night. As the day wore on, these tools made hunting possible, turning humans into predators who could compete with and outsmart the apex animals that roamed around them. A single dull spear tip could jeopardize an entire group's chance at securing food, underscoring just how critical these pieces of stone, bone, and sinew truly were. Next time you look at a basic tool, a knife, a hammer, even a sharp pencil, remember that long ago, those tools didn't just make tasks easier, they made life possible. With their jagged edges and primitive ingenuity, Paleolithic tools helped humans claim a foothold in a world that wasn't made for them. Speaking of claiming their stake in the wild, the next step wasn't just about tools, but about the high-stakes teamwork needed to bring down prey. And that's where the story turns next, into the dangerous, unpredictable world of the Paleolithic hunt. Imagine crouching in the tall grass, your heart pounding loud enough that you're convinced every animal within a mile can hear it. Ahead of you, the mammoth, this massive lumbering beast, shifts its weight. It's a walking mountain of muscle and fur, and it has no idea you're there. The plan is simple on paper. Lure it to the traps, drive it into a tight corner, or, if nothing else works, overwhelm it with sheer chaos. But that's the thing about plans. They're great until something goes wrong. In a moment, one misstep, one bad call, or even the direction of the wind could turn you from the hunter into the hunted. And something tells me a mammoth isn't very forgiving. For Paleolithic humans, hunting was one of the riskiest parts of survival. Yes, the payoff was enormous. A single mammoth, bison, or even a wild horse could provide enough food to keep the entire group going for days, maybe even a week. But the risks weren't just high, they were brutal. Large prey didn't come with a warning label, but you didn't need one to know this wasn't going to end well if you failed. You weren't the only predator stalking the grass. Wolves, lions, or even competing human groups could be out there too, eyeing the same prize. And if the animal decided it had had enough, you were facing injuries, possibly fatal ones, from tusks, hooves, horns, or even a well-aimed kick. Hunting big game wasn't some casual outing. It was strategy, it was sweat, and it was a test of how well a group could come together when it mattered most. First came scouting, where the hunters searched for herds or signs of nearby animals. Tracks, droppings, tufts of fur snagged on branches. These were their road maps, signs that prey was close. Scouting wasn't just about location. It was about reading the terrain and identifying where nature might lend a helping hand. A herd wandering near a steep cliff or a riverbank. Perfect. These kinds of natural features made it easier to corner prey. But if herds were scattered across open fields, that meant more work, more running, and more chances for things to spiral out of control. Once the scouts reported back, the planning began. Who would chase? Who would ambush? Who would hang back, maybe as a lookout or a backup if things went sideways? Every person had a role, even if that role involved standing on a rock, yelling. The traps, when used, had to be prepared in advance. A pit covered with branches and leaves wouldn't catch anything if it wasn't perfectly placed along the herd's possible escape route. And even then, traps weren't a guarantee. If an animal avoided it, or if it decided to charge instead of running, it would force the hunters to improvise. There's only so much planning you can do when your prey doesn't follow the script. The big moment came when the hunting party put their plan into action. Imagine a dozen men and women armed with spears and clubs, spreading out with careful, tense movements. Then, in a flash of yells, gesturing, and flying sticks, it began. Ambushes, for the most part, relied on confusion. By making as much noise as humanly possible, hunters hoped to disorient their prey, pushing it towards traps or natural barriers. Spears flew through the air, aimed more for slowing the animal down than killing it on the spot. Taking down something the size of a mammoth with a wooden spear wasn't a one-step process. It could turn into a drawn-out chase, a test of endurance where the hunters needed more stamina than their prey. For smaller animals like deer or boar, the method changed slightly. Spear throwing remained popular, often mixed with flanking, the hunters surrounding the animal and closing in with precision. Traps also played a role here. Pit traps, snares, or even lures using food could make a quick morning hunt far more efficient. But again, no guarantees. The animal might outsmart the party entirely, or worse, fight back. Boars, for example, weren't in the mood to cooperate. Chasing a pig through the woods probably wasn't a phrase they used, but judging by how unpredictable these animals could be, it might as well have been an unofficial part of the Paleolithic experience. And when hunts failed, they really failed. Imagine trekking back to camp empty-handed, sore, covered in cuts from brambles, and, probably, enduring a lot of muttered complaints from those who stayed behind like, "What happened? Did the deer outrun you again?" Of course there were excuses. Winds shifting unexpectedly, bad luck, a sneeze at the wrong moment. But unsuccessful hunts weren't just frustrating. They left the camp relying even more on its foragers to make up the deficit. On the rare days when the hunt succeeded, though, the mood shifted completely. Dragging a massive kill back to camp wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. That meat wasn't just calories or survival fuel, it was status. The hunter who delivered the killing blow earned something akin to bragging rights within the group. They might get first pick of the meat or a little extra company around the fire later that night. That said, most Paleolithic groups understood that sharing was non-negotiable. Hoarding meat, despite how hard-earned it was, could lead to resentment, distrust, and fractures in the group. Cooperation was vital, both in the hunt and afterward. Sharing wasn't about generosity, it was about survival. No one wanted to be the person excluded the next time a mammoth walked into view. The challenges didn't end once the prey was down. The real work often came after the kill. Processing an animal the size of a mammoth, or even a deer, was no small task. The skin had to be stripped, the organs removed, and the meat divided into manageable pieces. Bones were kept for tools, hides repurposed into clothing or shelter, and sinew saved for things like binding spearheads. Nothing went to waste. Even the marrow hidden inside bones, the fatty, nutrient-rich core, was cracked open and shared among the group. But this processing also carried its own risks. A poorly handled knife, or even a sharp stone, could leave you with cuts or injuries that, in this world, often meant infection. Hunting wasn't just about putting food on the table, though. It was woven into the social dynamics of the group. The physical strength and skill required to take down large animals naturally placed hunters in higher regard, not just for their abilities, but for their contributions to the group's survival. Successful hunts weren't just meals. They were proof of strength, strategy, and teamwork. And for the younger members of the group, tagging along on these hunts wasn't just training. It was how they earned their place among the more experienced hunters, learning firsthand the raw intensity of the moment when survival teetered on a spear's tip. Of course, not every meal required this level of effort. Hunting might grab all the glory, but it wasn't the most reliable source of food. Foraging, quiet, consistent, and far less likely to end with a hoof to the face, often carried the day-to-day survival burden. If the traps came up empty, or the larger prey proved too elusive, the group leaned on foraged roots, berries, and insects to fill in the gaps. Hunting provided the celebration, the banner moments of Paleolithic life, but foraging provided the steady background rhythm. Still, hunting carried its own rewards beyond food and respect. It was a test of wits, strength, and unity. The relationships forged in the chaos of a hunt, shouting directions, covering for each other, sharing the load of a successful kill, built bonds that extended long after the spears were put away. These weren't just groups of people working together. They were tight-knit communities that relied on each other in ways modern life rarely demands. And so, as the hunters packed away their tools, wiped the sweat from their foreheads, and began the return trip to camp, they carried more than just meat. They carried stories of near misses, clever strategies, and the tiny triumphs that made it all worth it. Stories that would be retold, perhaps exaggerated just slightly, around the fire that night, ensuring that even in the dark and cold, the group would remember why they fought so hard to survive. But while hunting came with its dramatic highs and devastating lows, the work of foraging was just as critical, if a bit quieter. Behind every hunter was a forager armed not with spears, but with knowledge, precision, and sometimes a digging stick, and that's where we're heading next. What they brought back might not have been glamorous, but it often made the difference between a full stomach and an empty one. Imagine walking miles every day, and I mean miles, just to keep the mental image of your home turf in perfect detail. Your survival and your entire families depended on it. Every berry bush, every nut tree, Every scrubby little patch of edible weeds had to be logged away in your memory, along with the unspoken footnotes. Don't eat these berries. Or yes, but only after winter frost. Foraging wasn't just about picking stuff up. It was a survival algorithm running 24/7 in the Paleolithic brain. You weren't just wandering aimlessly through the wilderness. You were navigating a living, breathing map etched into your mind. Think of it this way. While hunters might get the spotlight, the steady, reliable work of foraging carried the tribe through the days when the spears came back empty. Plants don't run. Nuts don't stab you. That's what made foraging the fallback strategy of early humans. It was dependable during lean times, a safety net they couldn't afford to ignore. But dependable didn't mean easy. Imagine spending your whole morning hunched over in rocky soil, rooting around for tubers you hoped weren't too dry or bitter to eat. If there was a good patch of edible roots within 10 miles, you'd better know exactly how to find it. But here's the catch. Not every plant was edible, and some were downright deadly. Misidentifying a plant wasn't just an embarrassing mistake. It could get you killed. Foraging required a massive mental database. This was knowledge passed down in whispers and warnings. Which leaves to chew, which berries to avoid, which mushrooms would let you see colors, and which would, well, end your unfortunate experiment on the spot. Sometimes these lessons were learned the hard way. There's a difference between edible and actually good for you, and Paleolithic people walked that fine line every day. And it wasn't just about finding food, it was about when you found it. Seasons were everything. Maybe that grove of hazelnuts you discovered would be loaded if you timed it right, but show up too early and you'd come home empty-handed. Roots were easier to dig up during wetter months, when the ground softened, and berries, of course, had their moment too. Summer might feel like a buffet if you knew where to look, but winter, that was survival mode. You didn't just forage in winter, you scrounged. Bark could become a calorie source, believe it or not. You could strip it, scrape it, and turn it into emergency food. Not your first choice, obviously, but when it's bark or nothing, you'll eat the bark. Foragers didn't just focus on food either. They were multitaskers. While they gathered berries or yanked tubers out of the dirt, they also kept an eye out for firewood, medicinal plants, even materials for tools. A single trip into the wilderness had to count. You might spot feathers left behind by scavenger birds or chunks of dried moss that could be tinder for the evening fire. And this wasn't casual collecting. Everything mattered because nearly everything had a use. Nothing went unnoticed if it meant better tools, warmer nights, or a chance to keep someone in the group alive just a little longer. Foraging groups often included women, older adults, and kids, which might make it sound like the low-stakes alternative to hunting. But the dangers were incredibly real. You had to share the landscape with plenty of wildlife, and not all of it was content to leave you alone. Snagging a patch of berries could mean stepping into a hornet's nest, and that's a mistake you'd only make once if you were lucky. Larger animals were a whole other problem. Competing with a wild pig or a bear over a nut tree you've mentally labeled all ours wasn't exactly a fair fight, and in some cases, you didn't even know the risks until it was too late. Simple missteps, like grabbing a mushroom you hadn't been taught to recognize, could upend the whole group. Foraging wasn't just wandering through the woods and picking what looked tasty. It was a gamble played out with years of inherited wisdom and a whole lot of nerve. Foraging kids, though, were a wild card. Eager to help but rarely reliable, they'd sometimes drag back truly bizarre finds, piles of unusable leaves, mud-caked rocks, or berries that looked fine, but definitely weren't. Sure, it was frustrating, but it was also essential. Hands-on trial and error was the only way they'd learn what to avoid. With some luck, and a lot of patience from the adults, they'd eventually build up their own mental maps to pass on. In the meantime, life moved in circles of teaching, scolding, and the occasional near miss when someone stuck the wrong leaf in their mouth. But really, one of the unsung skills of foraging was the ability to remember where things were. Paleolithic foragers weren't working with hand-drawn maps or neatly written labels slapped on tree trunks. Their world was entirely visual and mental. They remembered landmarks, the oddly shaped rock near the chestnut tree, the slope at the river bend where mint patches bloomed, the shaded grove with roots buried deep in silt. This wasn't casual memory either. It was crucial. Forget your landmarks, and suddenly that perfect spot for tubers might as well be gone forever. Foragers didn't just carry tools in their hands, they carried the entire lay of the land in their heads. And this mental mapping wasn't stagnant. It changed constantly as seasons shifted or landscapes evolved. A bush that produced plenty of berries last year might not yield anything now. Or maybe animals had gotten to it first. Instant recalibration was the only way forward. They had to think on their feet, adapt, and be endlessly observant. It wasn't just about survival. It was about understanding the small shifting details of their environment better than anything else could. By the time the foragers returned to camp, they could carry an impressive variety of goods: berries, firewood, medicinal herbs, maybe even something rare like honey if they got particularly lucky. And when I say lucky, I should mention honey gathering sometimes involved bees. You could try smoking them out if you were careful, or not. Stealing honey from a bee swarm was one of those activities where I'm pretty sure they weighed the risk against the reward and said, maybe don't. In any case, while the hunters might roll in with game to show off, foragers often came back with something arguably even more essential: consistency. The thing about plants is they're usually just sitting there. They don't outrun you or fight back. Foraging might not have the drama of chasing a mammoth, but in terms of reliable calories, plants were the bread and butter of early human diets. If they'd known what bread and butter were, of course. That's why foragers were so crucial. Success rates were simply higher when the targets didn't have legs. Foraging wasn't glamorous, but it built the framework for survival. It didn't matter if you couldn't spear a deer, if the group's foragers made sure there were tubers roasting over the fire. For all the attention hunting gets in our imagination of ancient life, the people scouring the wilderness for roots and leaves often deserve just as much credit. Their work didn't just feed bellies, it laid the groundwork for everything else. And when the day's foraging was done, the group's dynamic started to shift. The frantic pace of survival gave way to something softer, slower. Back in camp, as the sun started to dip low, the pile of gathered goods turned into dinner, firewood, and maybe something extra: a splash of honey, a handful of mint thrown in the pot. Foraging was the quiet, background hum to Paleolithic life, but it wasn't done without purpose. It flowed into the heart of their daily rhythm, setting the stage for what came next: life around the fire. Because while foraging filled the stomach, the communal moments that followed filled the spirit. So, as the sky turned golden and shadows stretched long, something more important began. Something every forager, hunter, and child looked forward to. That's where we'll go next. The fire. Imagine it. Pitch black nights, no street lights, no phones casting a warm glow, no buzz of background noise. The only constant was the fire, flickering in the dark. That was the center of everything for Paleolithic humans. It wasn't just a spot to warm your hands or cook your dinner. It was the glue holding the group together, night after night. When darkness fell, everyone naturally gravitated towards it, not just because it kept predators at bay or chased away the cold, but because it was where life happened. If daylight was all about survival, hunting, foraging, fixing tools, then the fire was about belonging. Take away the fire, and the night swallowed you. Think about how vulnerable that must have felt. Daylight gave you options. The fire gave you safety when those options disappeared. Its soft crackle and warm glow turned an unpredictable, dangerous environment into something a little more manageable. It wasn't just warmth, it was protection. Predators, no matter how cunning, had no intention of stepping into a well-lit circle of humans tossing sparks into the air. And truthfully, neither would rival groups. The fire marked your ground, your people. But safety wasn't its only role. It turned darkness into connection, creating space for people to gather and share, turning survival into something bearable. Once the day's food was collected, whether that meant a mammoth, a cluster of berries, or just a handful of roasted bugs, the group would settle around the flames. They'd eat together, and that act alone wasn't small. Sharing food reinforced the bonds needed to keep the group together. And by sharing, it didn't just mean the physical act of chewing and swallowing. It was about looking someone in the eye and knowing you needed them, and they needed you. Once stomachs were full, the fire fulfilled another role. It became the backdrop for stories, and these weren't just casual throwaway tales. Every grunt, gesture, and whisper carried weight. A hunter might recount the chase from earlier in the day, maybe exaggerating just a little. The deer was this big, because what's the point of a story without drama? These tales weren't just ego boosts for the storyteller. They taught vital lessons, like where good hunting spots were or how to avoid the mistakes someone else barely survived. Kids watched and listened, soaking in every detail. Maybe they didn't need to know how to set an ambush now, but someday they would. And the stories didn't all focus on what had just happened. Some pushed deeper into memory, telling of distant places, ancestral figures, or even spirits said to wander the landscape. These tales blurred the line between entertainment and education. How do you outsmart a bear? What plants are safe to eat in the spring? How do you survive a long winter? The answers came hidden in stories, easier to remember, more fun to pass down. But more than that, stories gave people something to latch onto. They created a shared identity, a way to understand themselves and each other in a world that otherwise offered little certainty. Of course, not all storytelling was solemn or instructional. Some of it was downright funny, filled with dramatic arm-waving and absurd sound effects that had the group laughing, even through exhaustion. And then came the bragging, a kind of prehistoric highlight reel. The hunters got most of the stage time, recounting in painstaking detail how close their spear came to missing, or how they tricked an animal into heading straight into a trap. Toolmakers got in on it too, casually showing off a new spearhead or scraper they'd spent hours napping, waiting for someone to ask, "How did you make it so sharp?" But storytelling wasn't the only form of expression around the fire. Music played its part too, in its own raw, unpolished way. Early humans found rhythm even with the simplest of materials. Maybe it was someone tapping on a hollow bone, or the steady beat of hands slapping against animal hides stretched taut. Drum beats filled the spaces between words, syncing the group, pulling them into the same shared rhythm. Kids, in particular, seemed to love it. Unable to resist, they spun in circles or stomped their feet in clumsy, joyful movements, turning the firelight into a stage. It wasn't about formal dances or planned performances. It was spontaneous. Movement for the sake of movement, sound for the sake of sound. Even chants and primitive instruments added to the mood. Someone blowing into a carved bone might produce a low, eerie whistle, rising and falling with the crackle of the flames. These sounds didn't just entertain. They deepened the connection between people. Rhythms became familiar, the whistling melodies, the steady drumbeat. Everyone knew what came next. In a life defined by uncertainty, this shared thread of music offered something calming, grounding even. In the firelight, surrounded by shadows, it wasn't hard to picture how these moments became small, but vital escapes from the grind of survival. Then there were the quieter activities, the ones that didn't demand attention, but still tethered the group together. Someone might use the fire's glow to quietly sharpen tools, the edges catching flickers of orange light. Another might sew strips of hide together into clothing, painstakingly threading sinew through tiny holes. Parents might lend their focus to restless children, soothing them with whispers or bouncing them on their knees. These small, unspoken acts were as much a part of the fire's life as the louder storytelling and music. They reflected an everyday practicality where even downtime had a purpose. It's easy to imagine how these activities blurred together. Picture a hunter bragging about their latest triumph, while the distant beat of drumming continued, almost as a background pulse. A child laughs mid-spin as someone mimes sneaking up on prey, and another tugs on a parent's sleeve to pass the time through questions. Why do we do it like this? Why not some other way? And through it all, the fire remained steady, a constant in a world that didn't often promise permanence. Still, the fire wasn't just fun, stories, or bragging rights. It was also a shared responsibility. Someone had to keep it burning. Elders, those less able to hunt or forage, often stayed behind to stoke the flames, adding dry wood or adjusting the logs to ensure the fire stayed alive. And the pressure to keep it alive was always there. Without it, everything fell apart. No warmth, no light, no protective barrier between the group and the dangers lurking just beyond the glow. Losing the fire was more than an inconvenience. It was an unspoken failure that carried the weight for every member of the group. And yet, because of the fire's constancy, it became more than a survival tool. It became the heart of the community. It marked the boundaries of home. Sitting close to it wasn't just about staying warm. It was about being part of something larger. The shadows dancing on the cave walls, the embers sparking skyward. These were the backdrop of Paleolithic life, grounding a group of people who spent their days fighting to endure. Around the fire, they weren't just surviving, they were living. As the fire crackled on, the gathered group slowly shifted into those last moments of relaxation before the demands of survival called them back. The next day, the storytelling faded, the music softened, and one by one, people began settling down. Someone tossed another log on the fire, ensuring its embers would last through the cold night ahead. The rhythmic sounds of sharpening tools stopped. A child let out a final yawn before curling up close to family members. The fire dimmed slightly, but it never went out. Not completely. Too much depended on it. And in its glow, Paleolithic humans found connection, protection, and perhaps a small reminder of something bigger than themselves. The night ended the same way it always did, with quiet preparation for whatever the next day would demand. Because long after the flames turned to coals, the fire's rhythm carried on, reminding them that together they could face another day. As the fire dimmed and the first stars began to peek through the inky sky, the group quietly transitioned into the final moments of their day. These weren't hours for lounging or idle relaxation. Life didn't allow for that. Instead, these evenings were marked by small but deliberate tasks, each one carefully ensuring the group's survival through the night. Exhaustion was unavoidable, but it came with a sense of rhythm. Everyone had a role, and everything had its place. Before the first eyelids drooped shut, the fire always demanded attention. The embers weren't just a simple flame. They were survival wrapped in heat and light. The evening fire check was far more than a casual glance. One of the adults, often the person whose turn it was to be on fire duty, would lean in close to inspect it. Were the embers still glowing a bright orange beneath the ash? Was there enough kindling prepared for the early hours, when temperatures would dip the lowest? They'd feed the flames carefully, piece by piece, so it wouldn't burn too hot and consume the wood too quickly, but also wouldn't fade into cold embers before dawn. You couldn't risk overloading it, and you definitely couldn't risk letting it die out. As the account goes, if someone fell asleep on duty, it could freeze everyone to death. Adding to this nightly vigil, the fire itself became a shared priority, even for those who weren't officially designated as its caretaker. Bits of dry branches gathered earlier in the day were thrown on carefully. Kindling, sometimes scavenged bark or twigs, were stacked nearby for quick access. Even animal dung was considered an exceptional source of fuel when wood was scarce. You could imagine a child proudly dragging back an armful of sticks earlier, only to find half of them were too wet to burn. There were always quiet sighs of resignation as someone picked through the pile for anything remotely dry. The fire's needs demanded constant attention, and no one could pretend otherwise. While the fire flickered and held its life, the other members of the group busied themselves with their own tasks. Tools, for instance, couldn't be left forgotten. The hunters began inspecting their spears for cracks, turning the wooden shafts slowly in the light of the flames. A chipped spearhead could ruin a perfectly good hunt the next day, leaving the group hungry because someone didn't take the time to sharpen or repair it. Sitting cross-legged near the fire, they'd carefully reattach loose spear points with sinew, tightening the bindings as though their lives depended on it. Because they did. Others worked on scrapers, essential for hide preparation. It might look like an idle evening chore, but that steady rhythm of scraping softened tough hides to turn into clothing or shelter. If it wasn't done, well, there'd be no protection when the weather turned cold. And speaking of shelter, securing the camp was just as important as sharpening tools. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, not even for a moment. Someone might take a quick perimeter check, ensuring nothing within arm's reach was loose or vulnerable. Rocks might be piled up against the edges of their shelter to secure gaps or holes that predators could exploit. On colder nights, the entrances would be carefully blocked with hides to keep out creeping winds. Whatever could be done to make the space feel safer, or even just less exposed, would be done before anyone dared to close their eyes. Camp security wasn't limited to the physical structure. The tools within the camp itself became part of the defensive system. Spears, knives, and other sharp implements were never stored too far away. If something came sniffing around the camp, whether it was a wolf, a wildcat, or even something smaller but persistent like a curious fox, those weapons needed to be within reach. threats weren't theoretical. Everyone had heard that low, guttural growl from the darkness before, the one that makes the hairs on your neck stand up. On those nights, even the smallest sound seemed amplified. A rock skittering down a hill, a branch snapping under an unseen paw. Every ear in the group would be tuned, alert, because survival demanded vigilance long after the sun completed its quiet retreat. Beyond predators, the weather itself held an unforgiving hand over the group. Rain could turn a carefully maintained fire into cold, useless ash in minutes if they weren't careful. Storms brought winds capable of scattering embers, risking not just the night's warmth, but the entire surrounding area. To prepare, some groups built low stone walls around their fire pits, blocking gusts while keeping heat enclosed. On the migration trail, where camps were more makeshift, strategies became even more innovative. Embers might be bundled tightly in moss or bark and carried as the group moved camp. The description says it plainly. In some cases, someone literally carried a glowing coal wrapped in moss or bark to keep the flame alive on the road. As practical as these nightly tasks were, they also carried emotional weight. Preparing for the night was as much a mental act as a physical one. Every person, from the strongest hunter to the smallest child, understood the stakes of these small rituals. Slipping up, forgetting to stoke the fire, leaving tools scattered out of reach, could bring swift and harsh consequences. It wasn't just a matter of individual error. The group's survival was a shared responsibility. One person's oversight could ripple outward, and no one wanted to be the reason the group suffered through a freezing night or woke up to a predator lurking too close. The weight of these duties wasn't assigned lightly. Yet, within routine came resilience. These little adjustments, checks, and precautions painted a picture of how adaptable Paleolithic humans really were. There was no grumbling, no sulking, as someone checked the wind barriers or rearranged the firewood pile for the 5th time. It was methodical. Tasks were completed quietly, steadily, because survival left no room for hesitation or complaint. Each person knew their role, and each person carried it out with the kind of acceptance you only develop when there's no alternative. Before long, physical exhaustion began to settle over the group. The rhythmic movements of sharpening stone tools slowed, and even the most animated conversations dimmed into quiet murmurs as people instinctively drew closer to one another. Children, long spent from their earlier restless curiosity, were already curling into the warmest spots, nestled against parents or siblings under layers of animal hides. But the fire still got its last inspection. Before sleep, someone always checked the fire, the unsung hero of the group. A quiet glance, another small log added, and then the weight of responsibility passed gently to whoever was charged with tending it through the night. The warmth of the fire took on a kind of humbling significance in these moments. It was more than energy or heat. It was hope. No matter what dangers or exhaustion the day had brought, ensuring the night's fire was properly fed meant one thing. There was still a chance to wake up in the morning, regroup, and start again. Locked into this shared rhythm of survival, the group unknowingly etched resilience into their DNA. Survival was a constant reset, repeated every day of their lives. As the fire settled into its quieter stage, sending thin tendrils of smoke into the night sky, those still awake found themselves momentarily caught between past and future. Tomorrow's tasks loomed, hunting, foraging, repairing. But for this single moment, they were simply there, beside one another, safe enough, with an ember glowing steadily against the dark. It didn't take words to understand the importance of that moment. It was a rhythm older than language itself, a cycle that carried them forward day by day. The fire was more than survival. It was the lifeline that steadied them no matter how unpredictable the world around them might be. Each night ended this way, slowly, quietly, but with purpose. A last yawn, a hiss as a spark caught damp wood, the shuffle of movement as each person found their places on the packed dirt floor. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, whether they were ready for it or not. But tonight, at least, seemed under control. The embers glowed faintly through a thin coating of ash, steady and strong. For this Paleolithic group, each evening was a discipline, a practice in resilience. Nightfall wasn't the end, it was the reset button. And as the quiet fell over the camp, there was one unspoken truth that every person understood. The fire would still be burning by morning, because someone, as always, had made sure it would. Life in the Paleolithic era was, at its core, relentless survival. Every task, keeping the fire alive, crafting tools, hunting, foraging, was a calculated step to meet simple yet unforgiving demands: warmth, food, safety. Yet, within this constant struggle, there was ingenuity, collaboration, and resilience that carried humanity forward. They adapted, cooperated, and found ways to thrive where failure wasn't an option. It's humbling to think how far we've come. So next time you flip a light switch or grab a snack, remember, these comforts are built on the foundation of their struggles. Thanks for watching. What other histories should we explore together?